I'm going to do my best to translate Japanese pottery culture to you. Although as a Westerner, it's a little bit difficult. Things get lost in translation. You know, Pottery is highly regarded in Japanese culture, and it's kind of a national interest. Whereas in the West, it's a lot less popular and kind of less ingrained in our culture. So us approaching Japanese clay culture is kind of from an outside perspective because we don't really have anything that similar in American culture. So it's a really interesting thing to study, despite there not being a tremendous amount of information out there. This is kind of what I've compiled over quite a few years, honestly. This was tea bowls and tea ceremonies were kind of like of early interest to me when I started pottery because it was kind of the first time I was able to conceptualize past an object just being kind of functional in a domestic kind of sphere, where a tea bowl holds so many other meanings. The objects are encoded with so much history, and every single element and every curve, the lip, the foot, the glaze, the material, everything is kind of predicated on this long history. And the objects are really tied to regions, for one. This is another reason why I wanted to bring this up, is because it kind of piggybacks off of our discussions on sourcing local clay, because in Japan, regions or prefectures are known for the different types of clay that are found there. And pottery cultures, have been really long-standing in those regions. And so those clays can vary from, black clays, these purple clays, these, dark brown clays, white clays. And, these clays become associated with these regions, and then these long lineages of artists that reside in those regions. So it's all very complex and interesting. So chawan is basically just the Japanese word for tea bowl. There's a lot of different styles of tea bowls. Tea ceremonies have been practiced not only in Japan, but all over the East, mostly in Korea and China. The Japanese actually stole tea ceremony culture from the Koreans. They're really the first to kind of start the culture and kind of master it. But the Japanese, I would say, have made the most strides, if you will, and kind of substantiated the culture maybe the most out of anywhere. So that's kind of where I focused more of my studies, on the Japanese tradition. So I'm just going to throw some really just a few basic terms that are going to be associated with these objects. So raku is a term that refers to something that appears effortless. And that's less to do with the object itself, and that has more to do with the maker. And so, I've heard potters refer to objects as having raku-ness, meaning that object has just kind of this sense of effortlessness. But when you watch a Japanese tea master or potter make one of these objects, it is truly like an effortless type of kind of experience. They're very loose with the material. They allow mistakes to happen. And it's just kind of the vibe or the headspace that they put themselves in to create these vessels. Wabi-sabi is another term. It's misused a lot in the West. And, I think we have a couple Japanese people maybe watching right now, and I hope they're not cringing with my translations here, because They're never going to be perfect, unfortunately, from Japanese to English. And just conceptually, like I'm saying, like, you know, Western culture is just so different than Eastern culture. So it's really difficult to make true translations. But wabi sabi essentially means perfection through imperfection. So it's kind of this overexpression of the mistake or overexpression of imperfection. And when you kind of own that, you know, it becomes, you know, something almost intentional and something of high value. So, you know, I've heard a lot of people, you know, on Instagram being like, oh, I made this pot and it has a big S crack in the bottom, wabi sabi. Like, that's very incorrect and not how the term should be used. It's much more intentional than that. So just kind of bear that in mind. And then Concedo, I think, is a really useful word. And it basically means completeness. And for these objects and for the ceremony itself, so, you know, tea bowls are used as an instrument in a tea ceremony. And it's all of the elements of the tea bowl itself and then the actual ceremony that occurs that creates this sense of completeness. And so I talk about these long traditions with, you know, these local clays that kind of grounds the object to a place. Another huge consideration in tea culture is season and time. And so bowls and tea ceremonies are always associated with a season. And so, you know, that kind of like, you know, broadens and makes the experience more complete. And then, like I was kind of touching on before, each element of the tea bowl matters. The lip, the inside of it, the outside of it, the tactile feel, how the glaze is, all the wabi-sabi parts of it, the foot, everything matters. So it's really this whole concept of completeness that ties it all together. So here's an interesting few photos. So one of the elements that's not necessarily a requirement in tea bowls. So yeah, it's interesting. Like you'll have a lot of potters, you know, abiding by these rules just very, very exactly. And then you'll have kind of these new school tea bowl makers, and you know they'll just describe, you know, the tea ceremony as just a tea bowl and tea. That's all you need. So they're kind of omitting this like this long history and kind of trying to be kind of reinvent it. But these elements have been included for a really long time, and this is kind of the most traditional approach to making a tea bowl. So the lip usually will have this wavering quality, and it's referred to as the 5 peaks. So from my understanding, and this might not be 100% correct, the 5 peaks kind of represent the 4 seasons, and then the kind of eternal being the 5th peak. And then on the interior of a tea bowl, this middle slide, you'll usually find a depression at the bottom of the object. And so the tea that they're using for these ceremonies is matcha. And so there's going to be a fair amount of particulate that isn't to be consumed that will collect in the bottom of the tea bowl and settle in this depression called a tea catch. So that's referred to as cha damari, I guess. I've actually never really heard that until recently. And then the outer concentric circle there refers to the interior curve of the tea bowl, which traditionally should be this really nice sweeping transition. It's also referred to as a hip, but that's of high consideration to a tea master. And, you know, I could create tea bowls all day long thinking, you know, I'm following all the rules, and then I would hand this to a master and they would just completely throw it out and say, oh, that's completely wrong for 100 reasons that I don't understand. So again, like I'm doing the best I can, but I'm definitely missing a lot. And then the slide to the right just kind of illustrates the necessity of a tall foot. So you know, pretty much every tea bowl that you're going to see is going to have this really lofty foot on it. And that allows the person drinking from the vessel to hold it in their hand, and then it's easy to pick up. So in a tea ceremony, the proprietor who's preparing the tea will hand it to, I don't know if I would assume it goes counterclockwise, but I'm not sure. So they hand it to the person. It's usually kind of in a circle. They pick up the object and drink. They set it back into their hand, and then they rotate it like a quarter of the way. And then the next person's able to drink from another point of the object that wasn't touched by the previous person's lip. So that tall foot just makes the object really easy to handle and just kind of like wield in your hand. So that's like of high importance as well. And then we talked about season and how important seasons are to tea ceremonies. So this represents a summer tea bowl. And so the summer bowl is interesting because it's much more wide, and it has a much more shallow design. And that's so that the heat of the tea that's been freshly brewed can escape quickly, because the summer is so hot. You don't necessarily want to be drinking this scalding hot liquid. So that open form allows the tea to cool more rapidly in the summer months, versus a winter bowl that is much more closed and contained, which is going to keep that heat in the colder months. The spring and fall bowls are much more kind of subtle. These are pretty kind of almost garish examples, I would say, for tea bowls. So they're going to make reference to some kind of plant that's blooming or active in either the spring or the fall. So you see these like floral patterns representing the seasons there. So here's just a couple of shots of an actual tea ceremony. So you have the proprietor of the tea ceremony there, who is an extremely highly trained individual. Again, this ceremony has been practiced for hundreds of years in Japan, and they're extremely serious about following protocol and respecting the tradition. And so, it takes years and years for a person to become a tea master, basically allowed to practice a tea ceremony. Levels.
Did we lose you?
Eric, we can't hear you.
What happened?
Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. I think my internet is having trouble. So I just cut out a second ago, yeah?
Yeah. Okay,
cool. So essentially, these ceremonies are practiced at the highest level, even in the government. So, again, it's just like a highly regarded practice still. And so being a proprietor of these tea ceremonies takes a really, really long time. And there's all this, accoutrement that goes into it that are very specific. And I don't know a tremendous about all of the different objects that play into this. But I can say that, to the right, that is a tea whisk. So that's used to mix the matcha tea with the hot water that has been poured into the tea bowl first by this bamboo contraption that you see the person holding. There's a brazier, which is the heating element that is powered usually by an open fire that's inset into the ground, because this all happens on the ground on tatami rugs. So there's even more to it than that, tool wise, that goes into the actual ceremony. And then also there's always a pastry that's associated and paired with the tea that they're serving. And that pastry is also tied to a season. It's going to have some kind of seasonal, you know, a pear, or it's going to have something that's tied to something that's being harvested at that time. And then also there's going to be a flower arrangement and then a tapestry as well, that's going to reference this kind of ephemeral moment that's happening. So, you know, they're picking from, you know, a blossoming tree that's happening right at this moment. And again, that's kind of like the timestamp of the ceremony. So again, just that's the kind of concedo completeness. And, you know, this is really, you know, about hospitality and care of the guest, and making sure that every single detail is well thought out and well considered. And it's just a very, very intimate kind of practice. So yeah, and then the flower arranging is a whole nother practice outside of tea culture, and that's called ikebana, which is a really interesting practice that you guys should do a little bit of research on your own about as well. So that concludes my very, very brief introduction to Japanese tea culture. So let me figure out here how to get off of share screen. Not sure why I can't figure this out. In some stupid view that I can't get out of. Okay, here we go. Okay, finally. All right, everybody good? You can see me, you can hear me? Okay, cool. So let me just switch views here, and I'm gonna throw. So the object that I'm gonna be throwing tonight, I don't consider to be a tea bowl, although it's definitely playing off a lot of the elements of a tea bowl. It's kind of my appropriation of it, and so this is what I just consider a bowl. But it has that tall lifted foot and kind of that narrow foot and that wide mouth, so it's easy to hold in your hand. So I enjoy it as like a functional bowl. But, you know, as a white Westerner, I don't particularly feel comfortable totally appropriating Japanese tea culture. There's been some American potters that have been very interested in Japanese tea culture, and they've done some interesting things to kind of bypass that. And so I've seen, you know, Tom Coleman, if you guys know who Tom Coleman is, he makes tea bowls, but he doesn't call them tea bowls. He calls them bourbon bowls, because bourbon is, you know, an American tradition. So I like what he's done there to kind of like differentiate the two and not fully, you know, kind of appropriate it. So this will be kind of my version of a tea bowl. So this could go good or bad. I don't know in terms of how you guys are going to be able to see me throwing. This is kind of my first attempt at throwing on Zoom, so I hope the view works out okay. You know, eventually it would be, I think, beneficial to get some kind of external camera that I can connect, and so I can swivel more easy and give multiple angles, but I'm just dealing with a laptop right now, so hopefully this works. So just a couple of the tools that we're going to need. I'm just, you know, throwing with a basic, you know, tool set. The only thing that's special is this cloth string that I'm going to use to cut the piece off of the hump. So, you know, the main benefit for throwing off the hump is it lifts the piece higher up off of the bat, so it's easier to view. And so for these narrow-footed, you know, tall-footed pieces, it's easier if they're lifted up. You can view them a lot easier. And then depending on how much clay you wedge up, you know, you could throw a dozen pieces off of one piece of clay. So it can kind of speed you up a little bit if you get good at it, but it really takes some practice. There's some technique to it. And so, you know, it's just a time thing with the practice to get a hold of it. But I throw these bowls off the hump just because of that tall foot. But that's really the only object aside from teapot spouts and teapot lids, and then just other small lids, I find really easy to throw off the hump. And then they're easy to just, you know, rip off a bunch of them, multiples. So if you were an apprentice in Japan working for a master potter, you know, you would probably be wedging clay and mixing clay for at least a year before you even got on the wheel. But once you got on the wheel, you'd probably learn how to throw 1 ounce sake cups first, and those would be done off of the wheel. And you'd be required to throw hundreds of them, and your master would be smashing them almost every single time for probably another year before he or she felt like it was, you know, of quality. So that's how that would go down. So I've got my clay here. Normally I'd probably wedge up a little bit more than this, but I'm just going to be throwing one of these, so I don't need to deal with a giant ball of clay. I'm not going to go super in depth with throwing technique. It's more going to be centered just on throwing off the hump. So one of the things that's great about throwing off the hump is that you don't have to center this whole mass of clay. You only need to center the top portion of it. And you know, from all of our experience on the wheel, I think we all find it easier to center the top part of the clay rather than this really dense mass part at the bottom. So it's really nice to not have to necessarily have to center this whole chunk of clay. But I am going to cone it just a couple of times to mix it well. And then I'm just going to focus on just this top nub of this big cone that I'm going to make. So I'll just let that bottom part just be twisty and do whatever it wants, and just center that top nub right there, because that's the only thing I'm working on right now.
Eric, are you using porcelain?
Porcelain is great to use, yeah. I'm not using porcelain though, I'm using granite.
Great.
Okay, so the most kind of limiting thing, or most difficult thing rather, about throwing off the hump is making sure that you don't go too deep, and then when you cut this thing off of the hump, you cut through the bottom. So it's really important early on in the process to start marking the bottom so that you have a reference the whole entire duration of throwing this object, so that I don't go too far. So I'm creating this really deep finger dent in the bottom, and the bottom of that dent is going to represent the bottom of my foot. And you'll see me continually go back to this and reestablish that so that I don't go too deep. So now I'm just going to go ahead and open this guy up. So you'll see my hand positions change a little bit from what you'll normally see me doing on the wheel. My pulling is a little different. I'm using my thumb to pull instead of my knuckle. So I'm giving a lot of support with both of my hands. So this hand is really supporting the bowl. You can't really see on the other side, I apologize. But my thumb is going to create that indentation and then pull that material up. So I'm really just pinching. I'm pinching to bring that material up. So I'll do a couple pulls like that, where I'm just pinching And that's going to really start this object. And then again, I'm just going to continually go back and reestablish that dent at the bottom to make sure that I'm keeping track of my foot. So for this particular shape, I need to leave a fair amount of material at this transition. Let me grab my shape here. So this transition from this angle going into this angle, I'm talking about this point right here. So I need to store a little bit of extra material in this hip section because that's going to be bearing the weight of this upper section. And then I want the interior of my bowl to have this nice curve to it. I don't want to dip in that transition. I don't want to bump, but I need to store extra material there. So you'll see this bump that I have started right here. I'm going to leave that material there because that's going to be necessary to support the upper part.
Eric, is there any chance you can get a different view where the camera is a little higher?
Not really.
Okay.
I
That's
mean,
okay.
Higher, like what?
You can't see your hand. You can't see where your hands are inside the. Yeah, you can't see where your hands are or inside the bowl.
That's never going to be perfect because I can't keep picking this up.
Right,
Let's try this though. Maybe this is better.
Let's try it.
Let's try it. This is experimental, right?
Yeah.
Again, it's like my hand's blocking, so it's tough. I don't think this is any better. Let me try it one more angle here. This is a city-issued laptop, so I'm trying not to ruin it. Let's see here.
Oh, okay.
Let's try this fun angle, huh? Okay. Maybe. Hey, that's good. That's a little better.
Yes.
Okay. So, you know, I can use fingertips to pull, I can use knuckle to pull, I can pinch to pull. I'm using a combination of kind of everything. So I'm using my knuckle a little bit more now. So I'm going to start to just open this guy up, minding that transition, keeping that clay there. So I'm going to kind of skip over that. Now I'm going to start to throw this straight up portion of the bowl. And then another pull. And this thing is going to start kind of falling into the form that I want it to. Just kind of allowing the gravity to pull this thing down and make it more shallow. All right. So now I'm going to go ahead and make sure, so, you know, when we're throwing bowls, we want to be mostly concerned with the interior of the bowl at this part. We can worry more about the exterior after we make the interior nice and smooth and curved. And then if we have any mistakes on the exterior, we can always handle that in trimming. So it's more important to deal with the interior first. So I'm going to take my, actually I'm going to use this curved rib here, and I'm going to rib the inside so it's nice and smooth and consistent. And this is also kind of laying it down into its more shallow form, which is more indicative of that kind of Teabowl shape. And then I'll remove all the moisture from the inside. And then just make sure that it's all the way smooth on the bottom. I'm not going to do a T-catch on this form because this isn't actually a Teabowl. It's just going to be a normal bowl. But if I was making a Teabowl at this point, I would add my T-catch in. But, you know, I think it would be really cool if we, you know, sourced a bunch of local clay and then made some Teabowls from the clay that we found locally. That'd be pretty amazing. Maybe we can call them coffee bowls or something so we don't feel so bad. So now I'm just kind of establishing that more angular shape that I'm going for with this straight rib here. I can lay it down just a little bit more, but that's pretty much what we're looking for. And then anything else is going to be handled in the trimming phase. And I can make those angles even more sharp when I go back to trim this. I'm probably going to change back to the original view I had so you can see me cut this guy off, which is the kind of the trick to this thing, is getting this thing cut without it. Let's see, what's the best angle here? Okay, let's try.
Original view is better. You can see
Original
right across
better.
it. Oh yeah.
Heard that. Okay, that's probably good. Yeah, cool. Okay, so to cut this guy off, first it's going to be the trim stick. So you can see that indentation that I had the whole time, right? So that's still there. That's the tall foot that we're talking about. So I'm just going to create a channel at the bottom of my foot with my trim stick. So just creating a line at the bottom there. So that's my channel. And then I'm going to take my cotton string and I'm going to set it in the channel. So I'm just making sure that the string is in the channel all the way around. I'll try and do this on this side so you can see it. So you see I have it in the channel. Now I'm going to double over the string on top of itself, right? And so once it's on top of itself, then we can just pull through and it's going to follow along that channel. And then you're going to get a nice straight cut, nice and flat. So that's the process there. So let me wash my hands here and we'll take some questions if anybody has any. Looks like we have some maybe in the chat here. 1 second. If anybody has a question, you can go ahead and holler it out.
So how do you stop S cracks from happening on those pieces?
Yeah,
So I know I saw you compress it down a little bit, but every time I do that, there's always an S crack. So what am I doing wrong?
not compressing enough. Yeah. So I spend a lot of time, really using my fingers pressing down and then tons and tons of ribbing back and forth over the bottom and then, slower drying. And so also once I trim my foot in, so it's probably easier to see here. So when I trim my foot, I go back over the top with my trim stick, my wooden trim stick, and I burnish it. It's hard to tell, but it's very smooth and it's sort of shiny. And that's from me taking that trim stick and recompressing and shining up all of that foot area. So I'm getting compression on the inside from my rib, and then I'm recompressing on the outside. And so that's making that bottom stronger and less likely to S-crack. But you're right, Chris.
Nice.
That's one of the limitations with this is, these forms are more likely to S-crack. But you can definitely get
the part I didn't get was like, oh, you should compress post trimming to get the bottom a little tougher. I've always compressed a lot on the top when I'm throwing it, but not enough on the bottom when I'm going the other direction. So that's a good add.
Honestly, you can save a lot of pots that way if you catch them early enough. If they're not too hard in the leather hard stage, I've saved so many pots that looked to have like a crack that was starting to develop. And I went back over it with my trim stick and burnished over it, and then no crack.
Wow, that's cool. That's cool.
All right, let's take a look at the chat here.
I have another
Okay.
question for you.
Sure, go for it.
So how do you measure the height in which, if you wanted to make 10 of the same bowl, how do you measure that height to get the height right? Or does it matter when you're throwing it that you'll trim it to a size later? How does that work?
Yeah, so good question again. It comes from a lot of practice if you're trying to make exact multiples. I use my hand as my tool to measure. So, you know, I know that, you know, I bring up the material and I know exactly kind of my hand shape that creates the right amount of material. It's, if I cut it off the top, I could tell you it's probably 3/4 of a pound. So I just know by, you know, I always tell you guys to always weigh your clay before you throw it. Not because it necessarily matters that you use exact measurements every time, but because it builds up in your head, and then you're able to just look at a chunk of clay and go, oh, that's 1 3/4 pounds. And I mean, the mind is just incredible for proportions that way, and you'll really develop that skill. So I know I bring that clay up, I know my hand position, how big it is, and then when I go inside of it, I know that I go down before, just after my knuckles here, and that's how deep I need to go. And then I use calipers to measure this width here. So I will use the calipers to keep the width consistent.
No, I got it. Thanks.
Yeah. Next question.
It's a chat question.
When you open up the nub of clay with your thumb, how do you know when to stop indenting the nub with your thumb before opening so you don't get past the point where you mark the foot? Again, that's, you know, I breezed right through that because I've done this so many times. But for a more of a first timer, you know, like I said, mark that really in the beginning, establish that indentation, and then you're going to need to change your position. So you're going to need to look at the pot from more of a profile perspective rather than this, you know, perched up above, which skews your perspective. So you need to like look at the pot from a side angle, and so you can see where you have that indentation, and then, you know, have your hand inside of the piece, and then you should be able to look to the side and tell how much space you have there. And that's just going to be practice too. Let's see, there's a little more to this. Where can you buy calipers that doesn't have a wing nut that rusts? Hilarious. Yeah, those things are super frustrating. I hate them. Where are my calipers? I think they're outside. I have plastic calipers, and I think they have stainless wing nuts, so I've never had an issue with those. But those cheap Kemper ones, they suck. Kemper tools are just like not great. So yeah, if you can find the plastic calipers, they work way better. You can make your own calipers too. There's no real reason to go out and buy them. I mean, you could make them out of a lot of different materials. And I mean, you don't even really need calipers either. You know, I see a lot of potters just using a chopstick with a mark on it, and they just set the chopstick on top. There you go. You know, there's also production tools that you can use as well. And those will help you measure.